We're going to start a new series. I want to welcome right now our Sioux campus. I want to welcome our Alpena campus, our online campus, of course, TV audience, radio audience, watch groups all over. It's good to have you. And today we're going to begin a new series. It's going to be our Christmas series. It will take us up to Christmas. And this is a series that really kind of is birthed out of a couple things. First of all, it's birthed out of where my son works. My son works at a place called Sight and Sound Theater. It's located in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. They have one in Branson, Missouri as well. And they do Broadway-level productions of biblical stories. It's amazing. My wife and I have probably seen 12 different shows there. And each one is it's just literally staggering. The special effects are second to none. They've studied at Disney. They've studied in Hollywood. It's amazing. And I remember when we went to see David, I think that was one of the last ones we saw there. And what happened on stage was staggering. But when the show was over, my son took us on a tour backstage. And when I saw what happened backstage to make the stage part happen, it was absolutely mind-blowing. Mind-blowing. And I thought of that when it comes to Christmas. Because let's be honest, we all know what happens on the stage, right? We know what happens. Bethlehem, Mary, Joseph, angels, shepherds, cry of a baby. We've read it many, many, many times. We've heard it many, many times. We've watched it many, many times. We've sung it many, many times. We know what happens on stage. And let's be honest, it's staggering. I never get tired of it, ever. Someone asked me just this week, why do you get so excited about Christmas and want to start celebrating so early? And I always say, here's why. Because Christmas is the only event in the Bible described by the words, good news of great joy. Only event in the Bible described by those words. And so I love what happens on stage. I never get tired of it. But I've spent time the past 6 months in preparing for this, going behind stage, backstage. And what happens backstage, as staggering as the story is on stage, what happens backstage is absolutely mind-blowing. And really, the other thing that brought this about was this past summer when I was preaching a series on Andrew, the disciple of Jesus. And we saw that Andrew was the first one of those who would become the official 12 disciples of Jesus. He was the first one to put his faith in Jesus, to believe he was the Messiah. And he did so after spending an evening talking with Jesus. And Jesus, from the Old Testament scriptures, showing him he was the Messiah. And after that, Andrew believed. Now, here's the amazing thing. There are over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament that show us who the Messiah is. God didn't want us to miss it. But by the time Jesus was talking to Andrew, he had only fulfilled 7 of them. That's it. And all of them centered around his birth. And that was enough to convince Andrew that Jesus was the Messiah. And so that's what caused me to do kind of a deep dive, to go backstage. And over the next 5 weeks, I would like to be your tour guide and take you backstage at Bethlehem. And as much as the story on stage is staggering, I hope you will find the tour backstage mind-blowing. Now, we're going to begin with this. We're going to begin with a look at something that bores most of us to death today. How's that for a beginning? It's a look at genealogy. A look at genealogy. Now, keep in mind, for you and I today, genealogy isn't all that important. Most people don't even really know much about their genealogy, and you don't work where you work or do what you do because of your pedigree, because of your genealogy. Some of you want to find out about it, and that's driven more by curiosity. And by the way, if you're interested in doing that, can I just save you a lot of time and money? We all go back to Adam, case closed, all right? We're done. Now, but if you were a Jew living in the Old Testament or at the time of Jesus, genealogy and pedigree meant everything. Everyone knew their genealogy. Everyone knew their pedigree. That's why in the Bible, over 30 times, you will see genealogical lists. Now, let's be honest. When we come to those in our yearly reading through the Bible, what do? We just skip right over them, don't they? We do that. But back then, they were crucial. Even the Apostle Paul in Philippians will go to great lengths to talk about his pedigree and the tribe he's from. So for a Jew, this was very important. But even more important when it came to the Messiah. Because the Messiah was going to ultimately be the king of Israel. And to be a king, you had to prove your genealogy. You had to have the right pedigree. So when we look in the Old Testament, when we go backstage at Bethlehem and we see the prophecies about the Messiah, we're going to see two things related to genealogy. Prophecy number one, it says the Messiah would be a descendant of Abraham. We know that. Genesis 22, verse 18. God said to Abraham, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. How? Through the coming of the Messiah. So we know that the Messiah would be a Jew. He would be of the seed of Abraham. But even more important than that is prophecy number two. And that is that the Messiah would come from the house of David, the king. And that had to be the case for Jesus to be the Messiah, for him to have a right to the throne. That's seen in many verses in the Old Testament. Jeremiah 23 says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, the Messiah. And if you go to the end of verse 6, it says, and his name by which he will be called will be the Lord of righteousness. So the Old Testament predicted two of the over 300 prophecies that Jesus would be from the seed of Abraham and that Jesus would be from the line of David, the house of David. Now, how important was that to a Jew in that day? Well, guess what? That is exactly how the New Testament opens up. What's the first book of the New Testament? Matthew. What's the first chapter in the book of Matthew? Chapter 1. All right, yeah, you'll catch on. Don't worry. And then chapter 1 of Matthew in verse number 1, what happens? The New Testament opens up with the importance that Jesus is from the seed of Abraham and the house of David. Look at Matthew 1, verse number 1. The record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So the first thing that Matthew says is this. First thing you need to know about Jesus in proving he's the Messiah is this. He is from the seed of Abraham. He is from the line of David. Now, by the way, notice the order he mentions them in. He doesn't start with Abraham, who lived 1,200 years before David. He starts with David. What's the first thing you need to know about Jesus? He's the son of David and the son of Abraham. Now, why does he start with David? Real simple. Matthew is trying to prove to the Jews that Jesus is king. And so the only genealogical fact that really matters in proving that is he from the house of David? So he begins with that comment. But then we run into a problem. And the problem we're going to end up seeing in verse 16. Because here's what happens. The royal line was always passed down through the father. And when you read the first 15 verses of Matthew 1, and I almost decided to do that, but decided I would not put you through that. When you read that genealogical account, there is a phrase that is repeated over and over. And the phrase is, so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, who was the father of so-and-so, who was the father of so-and-so. And that phrase, the father of, is repeated every time until you get to Joseph. And when you get to Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, it doesn't say that. In fact, look at Matthew 1, verse 16. Jacob was the father of Joseph, but it does not say Joseph was the father of Jesus. Instead, it says Joseph was the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born. So why doesn't Matthew teach us that Jesus is the son of Joseph, Joseph the father of Jesus? And the answer is real simple, because he wasn't the biological father of Jesus. We'll see next week in our series that Jesus is born of a virgin. He had no biological father. So it doesn't say, and Joseph was the father of Jesus. It says, and Joseph was the husband of Mary who gave birth to Jesus. And that might cause some people to say, well, time out. Then how can Jesus be in the royal line of David if he doesn't have any of Joseph's blood or DNA in him? And there's two answers to the question. Answer number one is this. In the Jewish world, when you adopted a child, that child received all your legal rights and privileges. Joseph adopts Jesus, which would give to Jesus all the legal rights of Joseph, including the fact that he is in the line of David. But just in case that's not good enough for you, the Gospel of Luke will give us a second answer. Because in Luke, we get the genealogy of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And you know what we discover? That both Joseph and Mary, both of them, were from the line of David. Joseph was from the line of David through David's son Solomon. Mary was from the line of David through David's son Nathan. So no matter how you cut it, it's covered. Through Mary, Jesus has the blood of David, and through Joseph, Jesus has the legal right to the throne. And so in the genealogies, we see that Jesus is both of the seed of Abraham and of the house of David. Now, you may say, but there was many people that would have been true of. That's correct. But the next three prophecies can't be fulfilled by a lot of people, all right? So we saw a look at genealogy. Let's now take a look at geography. And some of you are going, my two least favorite subjects, genealogy and geography. But this is incredible. Now, when it comes to geography, the Old Testament predicted three things about the Messiah. Any one of them, okay, that can happen. But to have one person fulfill all three of them is crazy at best. What are they? Number one, prophecy, we'll call it number three. Number one, he's the seed of Abraham. Number two, the house of David. Number three, the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. We're going, yeah, we know that story. All right? However, while being born in Bethlehem, prophecy number four, the Messiah would be called out of Egypt. So how in the world can you be born in Bethlehem and called out of Egypt at the same time? And to complicate it even more is prophecy number five. The Messiah would be called a Nazarene. So not only is the Messiah of the seed of Abraham and the house of David, he must be born in Bethlehem, while at the same time being called out of Egypt, while at the same time being called a Nazarene. And what we learn when we go backstage at Bethlehem is that Jesus fulfills all three of them. Notice, number one, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now that was a prophecy given in the Old Testament by the prophet Micah. In Micah chapter 5 and verse number 2, which I think is the most important Christmas verse in all the Bible. And notice what it says about this prophecy. It says, "But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah." So stop for a second. He's going to tell us that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. What's the first thing he tells us about Bethlehem? It was incredibly insignificant. It was so small, it wasn't even listed as a clan. It wasn't a destination spot at all. Why would you go to Bethlehem? Now, today it's different. Today, Bethlehem, over in Judea, in Israel, is a huge destination spot. I've been there 6 times. Every time I go to Israel, the place I get most excited about visiting is Bethlehem. Thousands and thousands visit Bethlehem. But back then, it was totally insignificant. And it says, "From Bethlehem, one," and that's a capital O, speaking of the Messiah, "will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel." Now, this is God talking. The Messiah will come from Bethlehem and go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. Now, that prepositional phrase, "for me," in the Hebrew language, it's in what's called the emphatic position, meaning it's at the beginning of the thought. Now, in our translations, we've put it later because that matches English grammar. But literally, it reads, "And for me, one will go forth." Do you know why Christmas happened? Do you know why Jesus was born in Bethlehem? One reason, folks, to fulfill the purpose of God. That's why. "One will go forth for me," God says. And then notice what else he says at the end of verse 2. His goings forth, this Messiah who will come, his goings forth are from long ago. Time out. How can that be true? How can Micah the prophet say, in the future, a Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem? And his goings forth have been from long ago. He's been around for a while. How can that be? Well, keep something in mind. Jesus did not begin at Bethlehem. Jesus existed long before Bethlehem as God the Son. We call it in theology the pre-existence of Christ. Micah's teaching this. Though his human birth will be down the road, his goings forth have been from long ago. Well, how long has he been around, Micah? He gives the answer. From the days of eternity. So not only is Jesus pre-existent, he existed before Bethlehem, but he's eternal. He's always existed. That's what John said when he opened his gospel to prove that Jesus is God. He said, "In the beginning was the Word," that's Jesus, "and the Word in the beginning was with God, and the Word was God." From this one verse, we learn about the incarnation of Jesus. He would become man. We learn about the pre-existence of Jesus. He existed before Bethlehem. We learn of the eternality of Jesus. He's always existed as the second person of the Godhead. And we learn of the deity of Jesus. He is equal to God. Incredible verse. And that verse is quoted by Matthew to show us that Jesus fulfilled the prophecy. Matthew 2, verse 4. It says that Herod, after the wise men came and said, "We're looking for the one born king of the Jews," Herod gathered all the chief priests and scribes, the people. He inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they right away said, "That's an easy one, King Herod. Every Jew knows this. He's to be born in Bethlehem." And they quote Micah chapter 5 and verse number 2. So Jesus is of the seed of Abraham. Jesus is of the line of David. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. We'll talk more about Bethlehem next week. But notice now the next one. He's also called out of Egypt. So how can you be born in Bethlehem and called out of Egypt? Well, let me pause for a second. Think about this. What did God have to do to get Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem in time for Jesus to be born? Remember that Mary and Joseph lived in Nazareth. Nazareth is in the northern portion of Israel, in Galilee. Now, Bethlehem is located 5 miles south of Jerusalem. Nazareth is located 90 miles north of Jerusalem. It would be a 95-mile trip on foot, at best on a donkey. Think about this. Think about it. If you were in really good physical condition and you could put in walking 20 miles a day, it would still take you 5 days to get there. But now, take with you a woman in her 3rd trimester of pregnancy that has to stop at every rest area along the way. It's going to take you a lot longer to get there, isn't it? Tough. So what in the world would cause Joseph to say, hey, Mary, I got a good idea. You got a couple weeks before you start having labor pains. Let's take a 100-mile journey. What would cause him to do that? Well, you know the answer. There was a very evil politician by the name of Caesar Augustus. And that evil politician declared a census. And in the census, every single person had to go back to the town of their heritage, which for Joseph and Mary was Bethlehem, where David was born. Now, what was the purpose of the census? To raise taxes. That's why the census was taking place, and they were already horribly taxed. So what does God use to get Mary and Joseph from Nazareth, 95 miles north of Jerusalem, all the way down to Bethlehem, 5 miles south of Jerusalem? Answer, he used an evil politician and taxes. Now, friends, I think you'll agree with me. If God can use an evil politician and taxes to accomplish his purpose, God can use anything, right? I love that because that's why, folks, I don't get bent out of shape when politicians make decisions I don't agree with. You know why? Because even though in their mind they may be ruling, I know that our God is overruling. And that's what happened in the Christmas story. So how can you be born in Bethlehem and come out of Egypt? They didn't come out of Egypt to Bethlehem. They came out of Nazareth. How does it work? Well, look at the prophecy first. It's in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. It says, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now, that's a reference to when God brought the children of Israel out of Egyptian slavery. But we also know that this is what we call a type. Though it was an actual historical event, it was a type, a symbol of what would happen with the Messiah. And Matthew makes that very clear. Look at Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. Now, when the wise men had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child. And by the way, that word child is a word that describes a child of an age that he can stand on his own. Okay? Jesus is no longer a baby when the wise men were there. Take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Now, that word flee is where we get our English word fugitive. Become a fugitive. In fact, it's written in a tense. You could literally interpret it this way. Joseph, get up. Take your wife and the child, flee to Egypt, and don't stop fleeing until you get there. Why? Because Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. Verse 14. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. And this is why, my friend, Joseph is my favorite Christmas character. I know Mary gets all the spotlight, and she deserves it. But let's not overlook Joseph. Two things to know about Joseph in the Christmas story. Number one, he never speaks one word. Read through Matthew, Mark, Luke. He doesn't say one word. I've long said, gentlemen, if you're an introvert and you're asked to be part of a Christmas pageant, ask to be Joseph. You will have not one word, not one line to memorize. And if they tell you you have a line to say, tell them that's not biblical, okay? He didn't speak one word, but you know what he did? Every single time God told him to do something, and he told him to do hard things, the Bible says Joseph obeyed immediately and completely. Have you ever thought about this? Of all the men alive at that time, why did God pick Joseph to be the earthly father of Jesus? I think this is the reason. Because he knew that Joseph was a man who would obey God immediately and completely. Verse 15 says they did that, and they remained there in Egypt until the death of Herod. Then they're going to come back. And this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. By the way, to give you an idea, from Bethlehem, it would have been about a 75-mile trip to the border of Egypt, then another 100 miles to civilization. In other words, it would have been almost double the length of trip as it was from Nazareth to Bethlehem. I have made that trip in an air-conditioned tour bus, and it was not fun. I can't imagine walking it, but that's what they do. And what happens now is that Jesus, just like the prophet said, is born in Bethlehem, but he also came out of Egypt. And then there's the third one. He is to be called a Nazarene. And this one is very interesting. Look at Matthew 2, verse 19. Remember, they're in Egypt because Herod wants to kill the child. They're there until Herod dies. And Matthew 2:19 says, when Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother, and go back into the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead. And we see it again, verse 21. Mark it down. I can't wait to meet Joseph. So Joseph got up, always obeying immediately and completely. He took the child and his mother, and he came into the land of Israel. Now, I want to pause for a second, because here's what I think is happening. I think at this point, Joseph and Mary have already decided when we go back to Israel, we're just going to go back to Bethlehem. We're not going all the way back to Nazareth. It's a long trip, and we're going to see in a second, not a great place you'd want to live to begin with. And everybody up there thinks they've been immoral. I think they want to go back and just kind of stay in Bethlehem. But something happens. Notice it. Let's keep reading. It says, they come back in the land of Israel, verse 22. But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea, that's the area of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. So he's planning on going back to that region, but then he hears that Herod, who's dead, his son Archelaus is now in charge. He's like, I ain't going back there. Now, folks, as violent of a man as Herod was, his son Archelaus was 10 times more violent, 10 times more vicious. Joseph says, I'm not going back there. So look what happens. Then after being warned by God in a dream, he instead left for the regions of Galilee. He ends up going all the way back up north to Galilee, and he came and lived in a city called Nazareth, the city where he and Mary were originally from. This is now going to be the childhood hometown of Jesus. Why? It says this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. Now, by the way, it is kind of interesting Because you can read through the Old Testament and not find that prophecy. Nowhere can you find it in the Old Testament. So obviously, there were some prophecies made that aren't all recorded in the Bible. And one of them that everybody knew was that the Messiah would be called a Nazarene. And in order to get that to happen, God uses another evil politician to get them back to Nazareth. Now, here's what you have to understand. Especially if you were born royalty, Nazareth would be the last place in Israel you would ever want to live. It was a very small town in Galilee. It's estimated that at the time of Jesus, probably about 200 people lived there. Now today, it's a very large city. It's under Palestinian control today. When we go to Israel, we'll stand up on Mount Precipice, and this direction we can overlook the valley of Megiddo, where Armageddon will be fought. But if we turn this way, we overlook the city of Nazareth. But we don't really go. I think I've gone into it one time because there's not a lot to see there. But there's the city of Nazareth. Now, the people who lived there in Jesus' day were very poor. Very poor. And like Bethlehem, it was not a destination point. In fact, Bethlehem would have been a far bigger destination point than would have been Nazareth. So as I did a little research on Nazareth in that day, I came across a study by a scholar named Jody Magnus, who wrote about the daily Jewish life in Nazareth at the time of Jesus. And you know what he called it? Here was the title of his writing: Stone and Dung, Oil and Spit. How would you like to have that as the brochure for the town you live in? In fact, he says in his study that in Galilee, the garbage and the sewage were just thrown outside of people's windows. And conditions in Galilee were both filthy and unhealthy. In fact, it was nicknamed the city of garbage. Would you want to raise your child in Nazareth? Of course not. But God made a prophecy that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem, while at the same time being called out of Egypt, while at the same time being called a Nazarene. And God orchestrated the events of the world backstage, even using evil politicians and taxes to fulfill the prophecies, to prove to a guy like Andrew and many others that Jesus is the Messiah. Let me tell you something else about Nazareth. Nazareth was in the region of Galilee. Do you realize if you lived in the southern portion of Israel in that day, Judea region, Jerusalem, that region, you would have looked at the entire region of Galilee with disdain. In fact, in John 7, verse 52, the Pharisees said, "You're not also from Galilee, are you? No prophet arises out of Galilee." So if you live in Israel, you look with disdain at Galilee. It's like the other side of the tracks, okay? But guess what? If you lived in Galilee, you looked at Nazareth with the same disdain. John 1 says the next day Jesus purposed to go into Galilee, and he found Philip. And Jesus said to Philip, "Follow me." And Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And Philip found Nathanael and said, "Guess what? We have finally found him, the one that Moses and the law and the prophets spoke about. We have found the Messiah." And I'm sure Nathanael had this urge of excitement, but his balloon got popped quickly when Philip continued and said, "It is Jesus of Nazareth." And Nathanael, who lived in Galilee, said to him, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" Why would you want your child to live in Nazareth? God orchestrates the whole thing to prove that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. By the way, I think there's another element to this, because the Old Testament does tell us that the Messiah would be viewed with disdain by the Jewish people. He would be looked down upon, kind of like a Nazarene. In fact, let me read Isaiah 53. Speaking of the coming Messiah, he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of parched ground. Look at this. He has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. If you have been with us for our previous study in 1 Samuel, I can say it this way. Jesus wasn't no King Saul. Remember we learned about King Saul? Tall, dark, and handsome. Tallest man in Israel. Best looking man in Israel. That's not Jesus. His appearance, you wouldn't be attracted to at all. He was despised and forsaken of men. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, like one from whom men hide their face. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. In other words, he was viewed like a Nazarene. Andrew, one evening, had a conversation with Jesus. And Jesus from the Old Testament showed Andrew, just using the prophecies of his birth, I am the Messiah. I'm the one who was born of the seed of Abraham, from the line of David, born in Bethlehem, called out of Egypt, and called a Nazarene. And we haven't even got to the two biggest prophecies yet. You see, as staggering as the story is on stage, I think what takes place backstage is mind-blowing. Maybe you're in a situation right now. Maybe you've been attending for a while one of our campuses, watching online TV. Maybe this is your first time ever watching or being at one of our campuses. And maybe you've never really truly believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the one sent into the world to save us from our sin. My prayer is that as we go through this study, as I take you backstage at Bethlehem, before December 25th gets here, my prayer is that you too would say, I believe. I believe Jesus is the Messiah. I believe he died for my sins. I believe he rose from the dead, and I put my faith in him. Because my friend, if you've never made that decision of faith, and you make that decision of faith before December 25th, I can tell you this, you will experience the most meaningful Christmas you've ever experienced in all of your life. We'll continue next week.